love to provide a great welcome to y'all for being here. Thank you. If you made it, welcome back. If you made it yesterday, welcome for the first time. If this is the first day you're here, we are going to be in this space and next door all day today. Just as a brief rundown, we're going to do a panel right now. We'll have a quick break, followed by another panel on extreme heat. And then we'll have our post-reception, networking, and reception next door starting at 3:30, and also a workshop that will be outside, that will meet out right outside these doors at 3:15 with Rosemary Candelario. Just some quick housekeeping. Our restrooms are just to the left down here on this hall. Also, for food, everything is compostable except for the little coffee creamers, and there's a little cute little trash can here for those. But other than that, everything can go in the green bins that are placed in the back of the room in the corners over here. And with that, I will turn it over to our chair, Paola Passalacqua, who will be moderating this dazzling panel.
Dazzling, wow, that's setting expectations low. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. I am Paola Passalacqua. I'm a professor in civil architecture and environmental engineering and earth and planetary sciences, and I am the current faculty chair of Planet Access 2050. I'm going to introduce the panel with the second question. So right now we're just going to do a round of intro first, but what I wanted to say is a topic that has emerged very organically through comments to various discussions that I've had with this group. And so it came out very naturally to hold this panel on space-time conflicts in planning, equity, affordability, and environmental challenges. And we'll dive a little bit more into what this means with the second question. But I want to give a first mention the panelists that we have here. And we have, in order, Matt Bartos from the Carco School of Engineering, colleague in my department. We have Katie Coyne from the City of Austin and Austin Watershed Protection. We have Nefertiti Jackman from the City of Austin, and Carmen Llanes from Go Austin, Vamos Austin. And so you'll hear a little bit about them. They'll have a chance to say what they work on in a little bit. I need to move to the next slide for a second. So one thing that we're introducing today, lots of the work that we do is about equity. And one way to be equitable is also to allow the audience to ask questions in the way that is most comfortable, which we think is through an app that is called Slido. So there will still be opportunities for you to ask questions with a mic if that's what you prefer. But we have seen with experience that these apps really allow the audience to fully participate, because there's maybe people that don't necessarily want to stand up in a room full of people and ask a question, and I would be one of them if I wasn't the moderator right now. So go ahead and scan the QR code, or you can go on slido.com. You don't have to sign up, so you will see on the right an opportunity for becoming, for signing up and getting a login and pass. You don't have to do that. You can just log in on the left and use PT 2050 as your code. And so that way you'll be able to ask the questions as they come up to your mind. So as you're hearing things, go ahead and submit those questions. They'll come directly into my feed. And then as soon as we open the questions to the audience, I'll look at the feed and start reading those. And I believe you can also vote your questions up. And so that way, it's always nice to see, sometimes, particularly when you're a student, or I was that way as a student, you're like, oh, my questions are not good enough. And then with these things, you're like, oh, I asked a question and got voted up. And then maybe, so-and-so super senior, the question doesn't get voted up. So definitely go ahead and use it. And it's the first time we use it. So hopefully things will work out. If they don't, we'll thank you ahead of time for your patience. And so with that, I'm going to just go back here so you see the names. None of us are slides, so this is going to be all discussion. And we're going to start with short intros from each of us. So I've already been talking for a while, so I'll steal the stage for a few more minutes. So as I mentioned, I'm in engineering and earth sciences. I'm a mixture between an engineer and a geomorphologist, and most of my work is on flooding and coastal resilience. So I work with natural systems and urban systems, kind of understanding how the coupled natural human system will evolve, how it's going to respond to future climates. And I do a lot of work currently in Southeast Texas, in Austin, and in Southeast Texas, and in coastal Louisiana. And in my past, I worked a lot in Bangladesh as well. So I tend to work with places that are highly populated, are going through compounding flooding events or compounding hazards, and the host communities, they may need support in identifying what strategies they might have in responding to these events in the future. So I'm part of PT 2050. I've been part of PT 2050 for several years. I am the co-lead of one of the flagship projects, and that looks at Austin and Southeast Texas and understanding the weak points of the connected network of rivers and roads and people, and how we inform planning so that we're better prepared for hazards. And I also lead a large multi-million-dollar project funded by the Department of Energy that is focused on Beaumont and Port Arthur in quantifying the inequitable distribution of flooding and air pollution on marginalized communities, and finding adaptation strategies or identifying adaptation strategies and providing the communities with data and model results so that they can advocate for those solutions. And a number of my wonderful PT 2050 colleagues and friends are collaborators and co-PIs on that project. And with that, I'm going to pass it to our panelists. Who wants to start? Carmen, I'll start with you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very honored to be here. Carmen Yanis with Go Austin, Vamos Austin. We're a community organizing nonprofit, and we work on healthy communities in the face of all the barriers to social determinants of health, but also climate shocks and stressors that are increasingly disproportionately felt in our neighborhoods of particularly the north and south portions of what we call Austin's Eastern Crescent. So the north and north central neighborhoods and southeast Austin. Those are the primary areas that we organize in. And my background in climate and environmental science, which is really about observation, right, and analysis, starts with my life experience of being born and raised here and being very close to the natural systems here, and also to the people's history that has worked to steward these natural spaces for a long time in Austin's existence, and even long before there was an Austin. This is a very sacred place with a lot of really unique geology, and especially our relationship to water and soil in Central Texas has been the underpinning of all of the history that's led us to where we are today. So my first experience comes from growing up and seeing the ecology of this city change over time, and observe that, and also be brought up with really good teachers in both natural sciences here in AISD, but also teachers from native and traditional communities in Central Texas that have really pointed out just how unique this area is. I went away to school in Chicago, at the University of Chicago. I got an interdisciplinary environmental degree around from the sciences to the policy and the economics of things, and I came back. Most of my experience comes as a community organizer over the last couple of decades, and I really cut my teeth as an organizer at Poder, People Organized in Defense of Earth and Her Resources, which for a long time was Austin's only environmental justice organization, really the first organization to come out of that people of color-led movement to remove and heal from industrial polluters and toxins in the Eastern Crescent, and in East Austin specifically. So since then, I've done a lot of different community work, and in the last 10, 15 years, a shift toward population health, and specifically looking at health disparities. As I got into that work, and over time got really familiar with the more north and south areas of Austin where we saw disproportionate rates of chronic disease, once again, we were talking about social determinants of health and the conditions people live, work, learn, play, and worship, and that's actually what I learned from the environmental justice movement. So it really comes full circle to an analysis of our built environment and our built-in environment, how that interacts with our social environment, with the way we interact with systems, and the ecology under us is the underpinning of all of that. Now, fast forward, those same neighborhoods that have been disproportionately impacted by lack of access to healthy food, healthy green spaces, and high rates of type 2 diabetes and other chronic diseases are also the neighborhoods hardest hit by flooding, by heat waves, by power outages, by all of these things that are now our climate reality as we get into adaptation work. So those frontline communities have tremendous lessons to teach us, and that is that's a journey that I and my colleagues and our dozens and dozens of partners across many city departments, some of you represented here, and neighborhoods in Austin have been working to address. These are complex problems, but they're not really complicated when you get down to it, those layers of people and land and policy. So I'm delighted to be here, and I'll pass it to the next panelist.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nefertiti Jackman. I serve as the City of Austin's Community Displacement Prevention Officer within the Housing Department. And I, too, am honored to be here. I am new to the housing sector. I often say I have worked previously in the nonprofit sector. I've been saying 25 years for I don't know how many years, and I'm going to keep saying that for more than 25 years. But I've been in the nonprofit sector, and it is that space that first got me into looking at gentrification, specifically in East Austin. I came to Austin in 2017, and I served on the mayor's task force, or the city's task force, appointed by Mayor Steve Adler to address displacement. And since then, I represented the city of Austin on a number of different cohorts addressing displacement. And recently, I'm working on a panel with the Federal Department of Transportation identifying strategies, displacement strategies, and toolkits, and a toolkit that we will develop for federal transportation investments. In addition to that, our team, my team and I see Nick, who is a student from the University of Texas, and he also works in the planning department, and we collaborate with them, so I'm glad to see him here today. We are also doing Project Connect, working on Project Connect, and with that, there was $300 million in anti-displacement investments that were approved to try to develop the infrastructure in a way that, or the transportation system in a way that does not displace residents and small businesses, which has historically been the case when transit investments have come to cities and towns. So my priority focus is really making sure that we're using data, we're able to map displacement pressures throughout the city of Austin. Some of that work was we're using the work that was began by Heather Wade, Jack Wegman, and Dr. Mueller, who's not able to be with us this morning. And that Uprooted report is helping us to direct city resources and finances to allow families and households to be more resilient in the face of various displacement risks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katie Coyne. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the environmental officer for the city of Austin, and I'm an assistant director of our watershed protection department. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but I think it's kind of critical for me to explain who I am by talking about kind of two core philosophies I have. So I have a background in environmental science, and I came back to UT, Hookham, and it's hard for me to not say go Gators also, because that's where my undergrad is from. But came back to UT for community regional planning and sustainable design at the School of Architecture. And I was always that problem child in science. I didn't understand why we didn't think about social systems and social and economic resilience and all of these systems that are just interconnected. There's no way to split them apart. And so one of the foundational philosophies that I have is, and I identify with, is ecofeminism. It's this idea that all of the systems of oppression and destruction that exist in our world are interconnected. So the systems that oppress people based on race or gender, are the same ones that lead to the destruction of the environment, that lead to our climate crisis that we're in, et cetera. So that's fundamental kind of baseline philosophy for me about how I think. I'm also a queer ecologist, and I don't just mean I'm queer, hello. I also mean that queer ecology is a way of thinking that basically says we have created a system of binaries that are false. So it is not. Yeah, gender is a binary, so that's the example. There are a lot of folks who now understand what non-binary is in terms of a gender perspective. When I think about that as the environmental officer for the city of Austin, though, it's pretty critical thinking too, because for years, we have been told that development and urban systems are inherently at odds with ecological systems. And when we default to that narrative, we miss huge opportunities to actually combine those goals. So queer ecology is also a critical way I do this work. I came into my role about 2.5 years ago. I used to be a consultant. I did work all over the place, which for me became something that I loved because I got exposed to a lot of different ways different cities would do things. I got to do new projects all the time. My ADHD brain was like, yay, new, shiny, all the time, which was awesome. But it also meant that I wasn't cultivating the kind of relationship with Austin and the accountability with place that I wanted to have. And so that was part of my commitment to taking this role. Prior to coming onto the city, I was actually in public service to the city, doing a lot. I worked on our climate equity plan, so that's of relevance to this conversation. Our climate equity plan is probably one of the most racial justice-focused climate equity plans in the country. And so that was adopted by council a couple of years ago. It's something that the Office of Sustainability is really focusing on trying to implement. And there's a pretty key shift in the way we did that process. And it goes back to kind of that queer ecological thinking and really moving past climate and equity goals being at odds. I can talk more about that if it comes up. That is super relevant to something that just passed at council, super exciting. Everyone should be excited that a couple weeks ago, council passed item 25. There's no promise that we will have a bond election this fall, but they've asked staff to say what should be in a climate and environmental bond package should we decide to put it on the ballot. That's pretty unprecedented. We've done affordable housing bond funding, we've done open space, we've done a lot of different work in that realm, but this is uniquely framed around the lens of how do we move the needle on our climate action goals, our climate resilience goals, our environmental goals as a city. We have a lot of unfunded needs in that climate equity plan, among other plans. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention, so I work for the Watershed Protection Department. That's where I'm nested. I'm an assistant director. I'm over 4 different divisions. I'm over a division that focuses on sustainability planning and geospatial analysis. I'm over a policy division that includes all intergovernmental relations for the city, so I get to go to the Capitol and have the happiest days of my life there, which is great, testifying at committees against bad environmental bills. And then I also have the largest team of scientists at the city. No one's pushed back on that, as I've said it, but I have an entire team that does all the monitoring of our creeks, aquifers, endangered species. They do compliance work, they do enforcement work, they inspect how our ponds are functioning, and then I have an entire team of folks who are doing more floodplain analysis and floodplain work. So that's pretty wide-reaching, and that's in addition to my environmental officer title, where I really get to work in a cross-departmental way in prioritizing environmental goals at the city. I'm sure it will come up. Home is a big topic at the city that really is kind of at the crux of conflict in these issues. And so how do we think about, a big conversation we're having at the city is how do we think about the way we might relax environmental protections, or there's a lot of conversation about increasing impervious cover, potentially to add more units of housing. And again, this is this sometimes false narrative, not always, around housing and environment being at odds. I'll stop there.
Awesome. Well, hello everybody. Thank you for inviting me here. I'm really grateful to be a part of this panel as well. So my name is Matt Bartos. I'm an assistant professor of engineering at the Department of Civil, Architectural, and Environmental Engineering here at UT Austin. My background is kind of a dual background in civil engineering and then also electrical engineering. And my research focuses on real-time sensing, modeling, and control of water infrastructure, particularly stormwater infrastructure. So for those of you who may not have a background in civil engineering, stormwater infrastructure consists of the built infrastructure such as storm drains, storm sewers, stormwater conveyance channels, and all of the different built infrastructure that you see every day but may not pay attention to that conveys stormwater during rainfall events. So when a big storm comes, that infrastructure is built to convey that water away from sensitive areas to prevent flooding, to store that water to prevent flooding on roadways and near buildings, and also to achieve water quality goals that can help aquatic wildlife downstream. So my research focuses on how we can use new technologies, so particularly sensing technologies and technologies for real-time control to improve those flood control and water quality benefits. For instance, using real-time control of valves and gates to reduce localized flooding, or also using control to achieve water quality benefits. So I can talk about that if there's any interest, but essentially using real-time control, you can essentially use the latent treatment capacity of natural processes to remove contaminants from stormwater. So I have a couple of projects that are relevant to the topic of this panel. So we're talking about space-time conflicts in planning. So some of my research involves, for instance, looking at trade-offs in how stormwater design mediates impacts due to flooding between localized lot-to-lot flooding and riverized flooding downstream. So we can talk a bit more about that as we get into the questions.
Awesome, thank you. And thanks to the audience, there's already 5 questions that have been submitted. So I promise we'll keep the last half hour all for the audience questions. And as you heard, Liz Mueller could not be here. She's unfortunately dealing with a cold, but she decided that it wasn't a good idea to pass it to us, so she won't be here. But we have these other 4 wonderful panelists that you just heard from. So just to provide a little bit more context with kind of like about the topic of this panel. Personally, so I'll give you my perspective, and then I'll open it up to our panelists to provide examples from their experience and have their opinion about this framing. What I encountered working on flooding in particular has been that often solutions, so starting with space, and then I'll go into time. If you think about solutions for flooding, they're often located somewhere, like in a community, in a location. And what happens, for example, and I've experienced with that in Southeast Texas, and there's examples in Austin as well, if you control flooding in one location, you're probably affecting those communities that are living downstream. So if you place a levee and a protection on the river in an upstream location, what's going to happen is that there's going to be all that water is going to remain contained in the river and eventually it's going to impact those that are downstream. And so we see lots of those upstream to downstream impacts that have been observed in several communities. And often those communities that are downstream don't have much of a say about this, and all of a sudden things have changed and they find themselves dealing with a different river behavior that they had before. This is also true in other areas, and it also has an effect on the time issue, because what we know from natural systems is that lots of the issues that we deal with today, they're often issues that we, and with that I talk about particularly civil engineers, but in general humans, have done on the environment. Like this idea that we could control water, and again my perspective is on water, and the panelists will bring up other perspectives, but the fact that you can control water, or the fact that, yes, we can live on the floodplain and everything is fine, right? We can just build a levee. Well, that has lots of issues. Like if you think about coastal Louisiana, where I do a lot of my restoration work, Katrina happened also because of the levee system on the Mississippi. If you're banking a river and you prevent it from expanding on the floodplain, what that's causing is land loss, right? And the data from Louisiana are horrible. And if you've seen the statistic now, the rate at which Louisiana has been losing land is not constant in time, and it's currently better than the statistic that I'm going to give you. But if you sum up all the square kilometers of land that have been lost in coastal Louisiana, you divide it by time from when it started, the statistic, the metric that is used is 1 football field per hour. So you're looking at a land loss that is incredibly high. And so when Katrina happens, you don't find those wetlands that are supposed to filter and kind of decrease the energy of these events. And then that's what happens, right, with New Orleans and all the death and damage that happened. So the levee, for example, was something that we introduced as a possible solution, right? And communities often feel safe behind levees, and that brings people to live closer to the river than they should. And this is what in our field and in social hydrology is referred as the levee effect. So the fact that you have a levee brings you closer to the wall, but it actually has more issues because you have people that live in the floodplain and they should not be living in the floodplain because eventually the river will want to expand there, and if it's not expanding there, we're paying for that somewhere else. So in engineering, I've seen this evolution from being trained as the lifetime of the structure is 50 years, and after that, we don't worry about it anymore. Well, now we realize that 50 years is just when problems start, right? You build a dam, you disturb the river, the dam stays for 50 years. After 50 years, your ecosystem is disrupted. The fish numbers are down. Your dam is obsolete, and now you have a disturbed river that you gotta deal with. So lots of the issues that we deal with now are about deconstructing more than constructing. And so I see this as a conflict also because from a political point of view, or if you're in governance, it's probably, your people are gonna ask for solutions right now. It's not easy to advocate for restoration that is gonna take 30, 40 years to build land. Who is gonna wait for that, right? Your communities are gonna ask for a solution that is gonna be in place right now. So in that sense, building a levee seems better because I can see a wall right now and I feel safe. And if you want to be reelected, probably asking people to spend 50 years waiting for a solution is not going to work really well. So I see that as a conflict. But I want to open it to our panel to see, what examples do you have from your work on the space-time conflict? And the question that I'm also going to ask, is it a conflict? Because maybe it's not. We've heard a lot about solutions and opportunities already from the introduction, so I'm going to let you say what you think about this topic, and I'm going to start with Matt. So we're going to invert the order.
Great. So thank you, Paola. So on this panel today, I really just have one point that I want to make. So I'm going to keep it relatively simple, but the point I want to make is that currently the way that stormwater engineers design stormwater infrastructure doesn't account for impacts at the system scale. So this is something that Paola alluded to in her overview of the subject, but right now current practice in stormwater design is to essentially design for a particular site without regard to how that impacts communities downstream. So a lot of you here are probably familiar with how increases to impervious area caused by urban development can cause more runoff to be generated. So as we replace pervious surfaces such as open fields, soils, and so on with impervious surfaces like roadways, concrete, pavement, and those types of surfaces, that increases the amount of runoff that's generated because less water can infiltrate into the soil. So many of you are probably familiar with how urban development in general increases the amount of runoff, which therefore increases the amount of flooding both at the localized level and downstream in rivers. So that's one of the big drivers of the expansion of floodplains, for instance, or the increases in the severity of flooding. But there's another source of flooding issues apart from just the expansion of urban impervious surfaces, and that's the expansion of stormwater infrastructure that goes alongside that new development. So stormwater infrastructure as it's designed today is primarily designed to get water away from your developed areas as quickly as possible. So we generally tend to put in big conveyance structures like conveyance pipes, storm sewers, stormwater channels to essentially get water away from our sensitive areas like buildings, roadways and so on as fast as possible. And that's reasonable because we don't want those structures to get flooded. The problem is that when we're doing this locally, when we're designing just for a particular site, we're shifting all that water downstream, and that has unintended impacts. So that can, for instance, expand floodplains downstream or cause flooding in communities that are downstream of the stormwater infrastructure that we build. So my student, Jimmy, for instance, is looking at one community where, due to kind of a lack of foresight, one of the new stormwater pipes being built essentially emptied out into another community and causes flooding problems there. So I think that really there is one fundamental conflict here in urban stormwater design which affects urban flooding greatly, and that's that currently stormwater engineers aren't trained to think about stormwater in this way, and current design practices focus only on the site scale and not how changes at the local scale can cause impacts downstream. And it's a systemic problem that needs to be addressed through, one, creation of new computational tools, which my group is currently working on. So currently there aren't good computational tools for performing these analyses because it's much more complex to do. And second, stormwater engineers aren't being trained to think about problems in this way as systems rather than isolated design problems, which tend to be much easier to solve. And once you start looking into these issues, you'll see that there's often a trade-off between holding water back locally and potentially increasing the potential for localized flooding versus letting that water downstream and causing flooding somewhere else. Okay? And that opens up kind of both the technical problem as well as the social problem of how to determine what impacts are allowable and where. So that is the point I want to drive home today. Thank you.
Going in order? Okay.
Why not?
I have too many things on my list for space-time conflicts as it relates to this topic, but I'll start by saying, City of Austin, most developments have to have an engineer that says there's no adverse impact in terms of flooding. And so as we're looking at new developments, most of them we're looking to the engineers to make sure that there aren't going to be any worse problems downstream that are going to be caused by new developments that happen today. So, but there's two different versions of flooding issues that we can talk about. There's that watershed scale, kind of system scale issue, and then there's more localized issues. And one of the things, especially as we're talking about densifying in single family neighborhoods, that's part of this conflict is when you go to develop single family, we don't ask anyone to submit drainage plans. It's not something we review for, and that's why in single-family neighborhoods in the city of Austin, there are some places where lot-to-lot flooding, like you're flooding your neighbor, is a recurring issue. And with inherent equity implications, because if you have money to hire a lawyer or to pursue code compliance through this weird part of our plumbing code I'm not even going to get into, then you might be able to get them to fix their drainage issue. But if you don't have the money or the time or the access to the resources to do that, it's very difficult to get those problems fixed. And so as we're talking about adding density, adding that additional oversight to make sure that at that scale, we're able to drain in single-family neighborhoods and actually be able to verify that there is a plan for how drainage will occur, will minimize some of those localized issues. I think another thing I just want to make sure is clear is when we model for where floodplain is, where there's risk in the city, we model the fully built out floodplain for the city of Austin. So if we allow up to 45% impervious cover in a neighborhood, we're not modeling for what's there right now, we're modeling for if you build the full amount possible in that neighborhood, that's how we model risk. Okay, so if every single person built up to 45% impervious cover in a neighborhood that allows for that, that is what we are designing our infrastructure to be able to handle. That's not to say all of our infrastructure can. There are places where our infrastructure is older and not sized appropriately. There are other bigger issues that come with flooding that are not going to be solved by, obviously, anything that happens in the future. There's existing problems that are really difficult to solve. The other thing is that there's a lot of old development that's being redeveloped in our city that's growing and redeveloping really, really fast. And we've missed some opportunities. So right now, if you're redeveloping a parcel in Austin, let's say it's a commercial site, maybe it's a grocery store, and it has a gigantic parking lot and a huge building footprint, and the impervious cover is already, I don't know, let's just say it's already 60%, and they can go up to 70% according to their regulations. If that person submits a site plan to do that, and they go up to, let's say, 65%, they only have to capture the increase in stormwater runoff. They don't have to capture that initial 60% in that redevelopment. So even if, when that was originally developed, they didn't have to capture stormwater to help mitigate flooding, we're still not asking them to do that. Should the burden be on the developer? I'm not even going to dive into that part of the question. But the redevelopment of parcels in Austin as we continue to change and grow and evolve is something where we're only capturing that increase in impact right now. I could also talk about, right now we're working on some code updates to protect the Colorado River downstream of Longhorn Dam. We have two very different ecosystems in Austin, west and east, very different soil types, especially along the Colorado River. That's why there's a lot of sand and gravel mining, there's a lot of agriculture out east. It's a very different ecosystem. It's also very erosive. And so we have millions, tens of millions of dollars that are going into trying to stabilize the bank of the Colorado River, trying to stabilize, has anyone been to Roy Guerrero Park? Yes, a lot of people. We thought we engineered our way to a bridge and crossing through that park that just got completely washed out, and so now it is years and millions and millions and millions of dollars to actually fix that creek eroding back from where it flows out into the Colorado River. So right now we're looking at what does it look like to have a larger buffer to help mitigate some of the risk of a very unpredictable system from an erosion perspective, both for infrastructure but also to protect people. And part of those conversations also have to do with equity. This is East Austin. There are people who have started to accumulate intergenerational wealth because they've been able to invest in homes that might be in close proximity to the river. And what is the impact on their home cost, their land cost, with an additional burden of regulatory buffer, basically, that might limit their ability to fully utilize their land as you currently could. But then we're also transferring the cost of a major erosion problem to the taxpayer when the city has to step in and deal with some of those erosion issues. So those are some of the things that came up for me. I think also from a conveyance perspective, when we talk about Boggy Creek in East Austin, that's a good example locally of a creek that the Army Corps designed to convey water out quickly. And there's good reasons for that in terms of actually the Army Corps hearing the community and saying we want the most reduction in the floodplain. And that's why that was designed that way. But now we have some new opportunities that we're working on at Watershed to actually think about how can we hybridize that system to bring in some of the co-benefits from green infrastructure and a functioning riparian zone along that creek that we kind of just thought of everything historically as what's the singular goal? Okay, let's get water out. So how can we actually think about that hybrid, that it's not a binary, it's not gray or green, there's some middle ground here on a lot of these things. So the last thing I'll say, I swear, is a lot of conversations too about affordable housing, and a lot of conversations where I'm asked, well, can't you be flexible on these environmental regulations? There's affordable housing units that are at risk if we can't get this project built, or my funding's going to run out next week if you don't approve this, is actually a very common occurrence. And I'm sympathetic to that. I'm not an environment above all. Like, we need to think about all of these things together. But what is the problem with flexing on environmental regulations that immediately results in environmental justice issues down the road? Do we really want affordable housing with inferior environmental quality in the city of Austin?
Right there? Okay. That was interesting. Yeah, so I'm going to go in and follow up what where Katie just landed, and I think if I can, I'm scared to bring this up, but in our notes, you mentioned specifically Colony Park and inferior environmental qualities that the city's standards that we're setting that are less in Colony Park, and this is predominantly, it's expanded, black and brown neighborhood that has not had the proper infrastructure and investments for years, right? So now we're finally starting to get there. But it goes back to, there's a couple of things I want to say to that, and then I'll go to my points. I'm sure that the community is not aware of what Katie is talking about. City staff is aware that we're negotiating to bring investments in affordable housing, but they're not aware that we are bringing them at their own potential expense in terms of the environmental quality. And I know if they were aware of that, they would push back, right? And not all of them. I know not everybody, right? Go ahead. You want to say?
I want to give us a little cover because
Okay.
this makes me a little nervous.
Okay.
But-
It makes me nervous too. That's what I was like.
And look, and I think everyone is doing their best to try to not further displace people in a city that is rapidly displacing people. So I am not trying to demonize the folks who are trying to do the right thing.
Right.
I think what I do want to say is, we've set up a system that puts these things in competition.
Right.
So philosophically, I can say we need to choose not to do that, but we're working downstream, no pun intended, of creating a system that works that way. I know, that was a bad joke. But we've also, that's based on policy direction. That's not even staff. So and again, not throwing policymakers under the bus, but we were instructed to, as we look at the PUD zoning, plan unit development for Colony Park, if we look at a development anywhere else in the city that is applying for a PUD, so this basically says we can figure out how to have a different version of zoning that works better at kind of a neighborhood or a district scale, that the zoning categories that the city has created don't really work as well for, because we're gonna design it better, and we do end up with actually superior designed neighborhoods and district scale work when that happens often. One of the things we ask for is environmental superiority. And so that's things like, more innovative green infrastructure technologies, or dark skies compliance for wildlife habitat, or there's a suite of everything you can think of environmental superiority that we ask for of developers that we were asked to be more flexible with for Colony Park, based on policy direction.
Okay. Because we both, I'm going to go on from there. One of the things that I want to talk about is really the land loss. We mentioned the land loss when these environmental impacts occur, whether it's flooding. I really focus on displacement. I'm not an environmentalist like the others here on the panel, but we look at displacement from a number of factors, whether it's a weather-related event, it's a financial affordability issue. But with the land loss, the things that we are seeking to protect is the erasure of community and the erasure of their culture, traditions, histories, and the erasure of the knowledge and people who lived in these areas. And what does that mean to Austin's identity as a whole when we don't seek to protect some of the most vulnerable populations, but populations that make the city more rich, more enriching, right? As we weave together the knowledge and histories of so many different people, but we have not been at a space where we equally prioritize different communities. And so this is why we're even having this conversation. One of the things that we recognize, flooding happens, and I know disproportionately it impacts lower income people. But what we are seeking to do is how do we position households and families so that they can be more resilient in the face of these impacts, whether it's a transportation impact or weather event, and what do we do proactively to invest? And I use the word investments because we value certain people, right? And I want to begin to change how we talk about different communities because we can invest in the infrastructure, but I feel that things like ensuring, whether it's rental assistance, whether it's mortgage assistance, we often see these things as a waste of money. And we don't always see the value of what it means to make sure people can remain in place. And I'm not talking about the need to relocate people when they are located in floodplains, and do it with a plan that makes sense, and do it where they receive the appropriate value for their homes, right? When they do need to be relocated for their protection, right? And the protection of the environment. First the people and then the environment for me. But the way development works, developers are not smarter than anybody else. Developers use something, there's a phrase that they use. It's called capital stacking, right? When you need to build a project, whether it's a multi-family project or single-family homes, you do capital stacking. Capital stacking is basically you're looking at all the different types of dollars that are available to make your development project work. Why can't we think of capital stacking for families and communities so that they can be resilient? One, into the infrastructure of the streets and roads, and making sure we have the environmental investments in those neighborhoods, but then also for the people. And there's so much research that talks about if families and households are stably housed, how you can reduce healthcare disparities, how you can reduce educational inequities. And for me, I see that as fundamental to the response that we as a city government, I see it, and I say we, the we that I talk about is usually the city government, right? As government people, we are public servants. And it is our responsibility to invest in what I will say the least of these. That's a term that people often use in churches or whatever, but the least of these, that is our responsibility. And then it is also our responsibility to ensure that we have greater demands of our developers and expectations of our developers, because we often give them a lot of leeway. And if we want more affordable housing, we have to say what we want as a city. And I know there's some prohibitions we have living in the state of Texas. As a city, we can't do everything we want. It is a negotiation. But I believe, and I'll say this, one developer, when I first started my job, I think developers really thought I had a lot of power. I was a community displacement prevention officer. Ooh, like Mufasa say. Have you guys seen that on Lion King? Ooh. Right? And so, I say it again, right? I used to hear from all these economists and developers, but then they finally learned, it's a title. I don't have that much power. Or I don't have anything that I could enforce. But one developer, I remember this conversation very clearly. He said the city of Austin to a developer, the city of Austin is like a very cheap date. We can get a lot for very little. We're not demanding enough for our communities. So I'll just stop there, yeah.
It can be done, y'all. It absolutely can be done. How bad do you want it? How bad do you need it? How badly does it hurt? Because I think a lot of times what happens is the compromise comes to the table and the people who are making decisions, they don't feel the pain. There's an entire conference happening that took this parking lot that's related to all the niceties of deregulation. And if you just deregulate, will you get more of what you want? And we have to look at empirical evidence. I'm sorry. If we're signing both, right? We gotta look at imperialism, the history, right? We gotta learn from our history. And we also have to learn about empirical evidence, the empirical evidence of lived experience, the empirical evidence of history. I guarantee you most of the folks in that area of East Austin along the lower Colorado River don't know about all of the policies and procedures that we're talking about, but they have watched the soil wash away. They have experienced it. I grew up on the east side of the Longhorn Dam, swimming in that river. And ever since East Austin's become very gentrified, a lot of people talk about the secret beach. How many of y'all have heard about the secret beach? You know what the secret beach is? It's the rubble of the apartment complexes that were demolished to put the Oracle campus, the headquarters, that removed thousands of affordable units, mostly immigrant families. That's the rubble that creates the secret beach. It's the erosion from that demolition. So that's the history we're on. And if we don't live that, if we don't feel that, if we don't talk about it, then we will keep continuing to make the same mistakes over and over again. And we're at a point of such critical urgency because of the climate stressors, because of the history that we're living, because of all the things people are talking about. There's a real desire to fix these things quickly, especially for the folks who are just now feeling the pain. Or just now learning about these issues and want to do something about it right away, right? And I hear things like, well, they don't call it deregulation, but relaxing the rules, right? Or missing middle, especially infill of our neighborhoods, not on transit lines, not on corridors, but everywhere that we look, right, is only part of the mix. It's not going to get us affordability. It's not going to stop displacement. But it actually can cause harm. It can worsen things. And if we're not learning from those historical lessons, we are gonna miss the mark. Now the hope, I do completely agree with Katie and others. A lot of these things have been artificially put at odds. And that especially happens when we are only looking at the bottom line, when we're just looking at units. I was in a beautiful workshop at our city's equity forum a few weeks ago about investing in affordability, affordable housing. And it's community investment, capital stacking for community, right? And so I said, first, let's define affordability, because that's a huge problem, right? We didn't get into a debate about rental rates. A couple of people talked about not spending your whole paycheck on your rent or not living check to check, but almost everybody else talked about quality of life. Having somewhere you can put your feet on the ground, being able to walk to where you need, access to get around, food that you can eat, people can visit you, you actually have connection to your family or your friends or your chosen family, right? The dignity, the quality, what makes life worth living. Nobody deserves fewer standards, because when the corners get cut, we know who gets hurt. We know. When there is not a regulation, we talked about levees. We had our own Katrina here in 2013 when Lower Onion Creek flooded and a 41-foot wall of water came at people at 5 a.m. with no warning. With no warning. Those people didn't choose to live in a floodplain, they were put in a floodplain. That land was developed by a developer before it was annexed by the city of Austin. So it was on the county. Those regulations that you can't put people in a floodplain like that didn't exist. And 2 huge neighborhoods on East Williamson Creek and Lower Onion Creek, many neighborhoods were developed in that area. They were military neighborhoods predominantly, and they were integrated neighborhoods, which means they were 2/3 non-white. And when the levees were opened and they chose upstream who to flood, because that funnel cloud hit in Driftwood, Texas, no warning system, right? Devastating floods in 2015. Now we know, because of climate change and development, this is an ongoing issue. But there are immediate lessons we can learn. It's not just getting people out of the floodplain, it's also figuring out how we make all of development more responsible in an interdependent way. And thinking long term, in 20 years, you can scale a community land trust. In 30 to 40 years, you can restore a wetland. We could also restore our topsoil, which is probably the most important part of our ecology that we're not talking about right now. I'm just learning that the topsoil on the west side, where it's only 4 or 5 inches deep, used to be closer to about 9 inches when this was predominantly, when you had actually like native pastoral lands on most of these areas, because the agricultural practices were restorative. And they have a lot to do with the mycology and the, all of those pieces. Now, in an urban development, and the densification of Austin, you can't keep all of that, but you can certainly put those practices in to functional green, to green infrastructure, and we can pause on the urgency, because we know we have a housing crisis, but it's mostly an affordability crisis, and it's mostly caused by wealth inequality and the casino of land speculation of real estate, right? We have been pressured so much, especially in the Eastern Crescent, to upzone, upzone, upzone so we can have these new developments. Half the time, those developers don't even build anything. They get the entitlement and they sell the land for more money because somebody will develop it, and it may or may not be the plan you thought was gonna happen. So all that to say, the urgency needs to be moderated. We can plan long-term. We have an infusion of federal funds through the Inflation Reduction Act, actually aimed at restoring some funding to disinvested areas. That could go really right or really wrong, but it can go really, really right. We can build some of these solutions into the problem. We can climate retrofit, take pressure off our stormwater systems, take pressure off our grid, and actually build affordable housing if we get everybody to the table and start stacking. So I know we're probably way behind on time because we're all talking a lot, but I just want to say, we do need to, we need to demand more. We need to, this is an incredibly valuable place for so many reasons, right? Valuable in the ways that you can't put money, a price tag on, and also valued in the ways that global real estate wants a slice of Austin if they can get it. So let's ask for what we need. We got into the jargon of planned unit developments, but the point is, when our city gives away development potential, which is probably one of the most powerful things a city government can do, we can ask for more. We can ask for affordability. We can ask, and that's going to require subsidy. Well, yeah, it is. Guess what? All of us have to find money to do what we're doing, don't we? So folks can find subsidies and still make fat money on their developments. Guess what? We have to require it. They do it in other cities. They can do it here. So we have a lot of tools that can be used. And I can give concrete examples where we've restored the contamination in East Austin and got developers to actually build deeply affordable, dense housing with actual adequate drainage. You can look it up right now at the Think East apartments. They're still affordable to this day, truly affordable. That was subsidized by the Cesar Chavez Foundation, and one of those developers retired. I mean, they did well. So it can be done. It's how bad do we want it? Who are we doing it for? Who is downstream? Who is getting displaced? Who does get to live in a place with no car and low utility bills and a LEED certified building? Who is it for? And what lessons can we learn from everybody who came before us? There's a reason it's so great here with this urban canopy. There's a reason our water quality is still pretty damn good, even though our population has doubled in the last 20 years. It's because we had people who had the foresight to give a public process and a negotiation on these critical things that we really can't get back. So I'm still optimistic. I think we can do it.
Can I respond to two things?
Yes, you can. I was just going to point, though, that you guys are amazing because it's 101. And we just finished exactly. So just half hour for answering questions. And Katie, yes, I was going to invite you all to respond to each other if there are things you want to settle. And then we'll go to the questions online. And actually, I'm going to take the opportunity while Katie is talking to re-put this here. There's a lot of action on Slido. So a lot of questions. It's working out great. Katie.
Just Carmen brought up 2 points for me that I wanted to touch on. First, I don't think we talk enough about incentives in the city, and I think we're doing a lot of work right now to deregulate, to allow for more density, to reduce the development burden, but really looking at ways that we can incentivize affordable units, higher level of environmental quality, actually using more innovative green infrastructure technology, and say you can unlock development entitlements if you agree to do these things. I don't think we have enough conversations about that. 2, you brought up soil erosion issues and soil loss. That is a huge problem. And I think the other piece that brought up to me, yeah, we're talking a lot about water and flooding, but there's also a lot more. You're going to hear a panel next on urban heat. We're talking about our climate emissions and how we can reduce them. How can we sequester more carbon in this city? One of the goals in our climate equity plan in the natural systems section talks about by 2030, Council has adopted this plan. By 2030, we need an additional 20,000 acres of land in protected status in the city or in the nearby region. That's a lot of land. There are about like 40,000 acres in West Austin that have been protected for water quality supply, for endangered species habitat, mostly water quality supply, because of a number of land acquisition bonds started in the 90s, and that's great for those reasons, but it has led to disparate distribution of open space. And the ecosystem on the east side is Blackland Prairie. There's a recent research paper that came out that talks about how, forests are great for other reasons. Shading, urban forests are great for shading. They do, trees sequester carbon. But this research paper said there's some potential in the next few decades, I can't even remember the timeline, but that said trees might start to lose their ability, urban forests might lose their ability to actually sequester carbon and might actually become sources. Prairies will not. Soils hold, in prairies, a ton of carbon. So restoring east side prairies helps us further our climate goals. We already have a goal of acquiring and protecting 20,000 additional acres in our climate equity plan. Restoring riparian areas is going to help with urban heat issues, habitat issues, helps with the hydrology of these ecosystems, so it has those benefits to water quality, to flooding potentially. These are multi-benefit things. The intersection of all these things is super exciting. So from a soil perspective, when we talk about carbon, among other things, that's a huge opportunity.
Awesome. So I'm going to start going to the questions on Slido. There's a lot of action, things being voted up. So I'm going to go kind of in order, but choosing also to mix it up in terms of topics. But I'm going to start with one that is actually the second one, just because I think that's going to help bring everybody into the conversation. Probably Katie or Nefertiti, can you address how is the city measuring equity in its climate change plan? I think it would be important to define it so that everybody knows what that is. And I'm going to try to do kind of fireside questions, so maybe I'm not going to ask you all to answer, so we can answer as many as possible.
How are we measuring equity in our climate equity plan? So I think, let me take a step back. The climate equity plan in process was probably the first one that really meaningfully integrated equity at its core. And that, from a process perspective, is the first step. How we're measuring that in implementation is something we're working through. Mark Kuder is here from Office of Sustainability/Resilience right now, whatever the combined version of that is, and can probably talk more about whoever is interested in that question about kind of how we're tracking that and tracking implementation. But the way that climate equity plan was developed was fundamentally different than any planning process I've ever been a part of. There were almost 150 different folks on either the core steering committee, which was all community members and facilitated by community staff, or by city staff, and then 5 technical advisory groups on the different topics of the plan. The entire process started with an equity grounding training by Dr. Tane Ward that talked about environmental justice issues in Austin and really helped us to start rethinking the paradigm that, well, if we think about equity, it's going to be at the expense of our climate goals. That steering committee that was community-led created an entire equity tool What's up, Kenneth? Sorry. Kenneth was on the steering committee. Created an entire equity tool. So those technical advisory groups had to run every action that they were proposing about sustainable buildings or transportation electrification through basically a framework that would say, what are you missing about opportunities to move equity? And there's kind of three ways I think about how you integrate equity in process. We've talked a lot about how do we see equity as a co-benefit? Like if it's not at the expense of the core goal, we'll further it. It's kind of where we've been the last 10 years. We started to say, all right, let's put everything through this equity lens, and so we can have an eyes wide open approach to what are the equity implications of this action we're proposing on climate. The climate equity plan said, we're gonna put everything through the equity lens, and if it doesn't move the needle on racial equity, it's not good enough. That's equity as a core driver. That's fundamentally different than how we've been doing work. So every single action in that plan was put through that analysis before it was in the final draft. I will stop there in the interest of time. If we want to talk more about implementation, I'm sorry. I'm gonna say let's talk to Mark.
Do you want to add? Okay.
Can I say something really quick? I have a colleague that likes to say plans can be useless, but planning is priceless. And I say that because I do think that process for the climate equity plan was unprecedented and very holistic and probably somewhat transformative for some of the city staff that participated in it. And I'm extremely concerned that it's not being brought up in each space of government where it needs to be brought up. And same with the equity tool. I think we've made incredible advances in the city, building a common vocabulary and a way to actually look at process and metrics around outcomes as they affect different people in different places in the city. And I am very concerned that the equity and climate work in particular is sliding back because of current leadership being very focused in a typical sort of business as usual way forward without actually learning from the last 10, 15 years what we have progressed on. So I don't want those things to be undermined, and I think implementation, the ... and the follow-up conversations there are really important for everybody who took part in that process that's still in the city and those departments to be continuously have this brought up. How are we getting there? Because they're very long-range goals, and that's difficult to address day to day when you have all these urgent pressures.
Okay, so there's a question that's been just voted up, which I think it does address a number of things that come up in the question, and it's kind of the elephant in the room, so I think we should definitely talk about it. It had to come up. And the question is, can you explain the home initiative and why is it controversial? I don't know who wants to start among you in explaining what it is, and then I think all of you have things to say about it. And the second question that is voted up is about green space development and management issue in Austin, and I think with home we can cover kind of both. Who wants to take it first?
I don't really.
I can give my concise version, and y'all can chime in with official things if you would. I have strong feelings about it. I served 4 years on the Planning Commission, and I also am, well, I have family. I have opinions about city government that I won't bring up on this panel, but I will talk about the Home Initiative, which stands for Housing Opportunities for Middle Income Empowerment. Middle income is not defined very well, and basically this is an infill density, basically changing the definition of single-family zoning, and multifamily used to mean more than 2 units, now it would mean more than 4. So allowing up to 3 units on a single-family lot. It's coming in 2 phases. The second phase talks about smaller lot sizes. So on most lots, single-family zoned in Austin, you would be allowed to build up to 6 units, maybe even 8 units or more in terms of building entitlements. That doesn't, like I said, there's no site plan for drainage. There was no affordability requirement. There were many, many unanswered questions about tree canopy, because where would you put most units in most single-family lots without removing a lot of trees? No parking requirements, all kinds of relaxed, basically under the guise of making it easier for a homeowner to build additional units that they could then rent out, have more income, and stay in their home, while also providing more housing. It was marketed heavily as addressing the affordability crisis, but there is absolutely no affordability required in it. And it was heavily promoted. First of all, I should say it was written by a very small group of predominantly developers and very few, there were like a couple of environmentalists, but most community stakeholders were shut out of the process. I think if it had been written by community developers, it would have looked a lot different. But it was very much supported by a lot of people who have private equity interests in increased infill development. And I say that because it's very clear by who was in those meetings and not. Hugely promoted, lots of money behind promoting the home initiative, and yet the citizen outcry against home was larger by about 200 more people who showed up with completely unfunded organizing. And a lot of those folks, contrary to a lot of narratives around single-family homeowners being predominantly white and more wealthy, it was a very diverse coalition. A lot of renters and young people on both sides, but tremendously more diverse, especially people from disability communities, those supporting homeless. A lot of us were saying, slow down, there's a better way to do this, because it could have been shaped as an incentive, to Katie's point. This could have been shaped as a bonus, and all of those things we were concerned about could have been wrapped in. But we had actual proponents saying affordability was a, quote, poison pill to this density bonus, because if you required affordability, you wouldn't get as many units. Well, in Austin, we're getting tons of units, but people can't afford them. So that's me going on and on in my own very biased opinion, but the truth is, everything I said about what that regulation was, it's a deregulatory move to basically add infill inside.
So, and just a little more context, part of the conversation right now, so that home phase 1, as Carmen talked about, allows up to 3 units on a single family lot. That is without any change in the impervious cover entitlement. So you can't build more footprint, you can just distribute it differently. And so the politics of that are, yeah, it's a missed opportunity to not incentivize greener design for a lot like that, or incentivize affordable housing. But
solar.
Now, yeah, okay, sure, incentivize all the things. But home phase 2 or whatever, phase 2A, or whatever we're in right now, part of the conversation is, what would it look like if we increased impervious cover? And a lot of us really focus a lot of that conversation on, what does that do to flooding, both downstream and in neighborhoods at a local level? Do we add a review of a drainage plan, or even just, do you have to submit it, even if, whatever that looks like process-wise, it's an additional cost to review, and also an additional cost to whoever's developing the lot to submit that drainage plan, so that's something we're gonna have to be able to talk about. The other thing we don't talk about is, yeah, there's flooding issues, but when you add impervious cover, there's more urban heat issues. We know that there's degraded water quality associated with any increase in impervious cover. Right now we're doing work, we're actually starting to use artificial intelligence to do some modeling work in the Watershed Protection Department, and having some pilot work done on this long acronym, Watershed Health Decision Support. We call it HOODIS, basically, and it looks at. Yeah, look, I work with a bunch of science nerds. I love it so much. Anyway, HOODIS is something that we're piloting, and basically saying one of the questions we want to be able to ask this thing is, what is the tipping point where if we have 60% impervious cover or 90% impervious cover, if once we pass 55, from a water quality or a habitat perspective, it doesn't really matter. But I sometimes don't even bother bringing water quality or habitat or heat into these conversations, because if I can talk about flooding, everyone's like, that's a public safety thing. But like all these other things, they're a public safety thing too. There are health outcomes that are different when you live in a hotter neighborhood with poor air quality, with less green, both mental and physical health. And there is science to back that up. But it's abstract enough for it to be buried in a compartment in the back of everyone's brain. So, yeah.
I'd just like to add on that point. There's a team that looks at the affordability impact statements for many projects throughout the city, it has to be included. And I think we're looking for more guidance and direction in terms of we're supposed to narrowly, and when I say we, the housing department, narrowly focus on the impacts to development of affordable housing. There's been these internal discussions, if you will, about should we be looking at things such as air quality, water, and those things are and each department, many departments have to weigh in on that, but I think there's an opportunity. We cannot do that now. We sort of remove any language that is looking at things that are outside of our purview, but I think we need to have a more of a cross-departmental collaboration to look at things that the air quality, things like that, and right now we're not really considering all of those things in our affordability impact statements, so.
And what is impact to the economic structure of a development, and
Right.
how do we parse out, how does it impact a profit margin versus actual cost transferred to consumers who are
Yes.
going to be living in housing?
Yep.
How do you figure that out?
Yeah.
Matt, do you want to add anything on the?
I think
Previous cover.
everything, yeah, I'm qualified to speak on has been covered already. So.
I feel you.
So there's a related question on green space development and management in Austin, and what is the role of public space and associated related challenges of public green space development and management related to these issues in Austin? Does any of you want to talk about green spaces development?
Do you feel
Or anything to add?
Sure. Yeah, I mean,
I can, but
we don't have a PARD person here today, but we have lots of folks who interact with them. I guess what I want to say is a couple of things with relationship to green space and relationship to displacement or sustainability of our social environment, our people. First of all, huge asset. I mean, we could never. Like, once you develop, it's really hard to undevelop green space. And we are really blessed to have a lot of green space that can also be more restoratively cared for, right? And I think that's a lot of what we see now is as we develop, how are we stewarding our green belts, our parkland, but also all this parkland we have that's mowed lawns. What is the opportunity to actually build in more restorative green space and achieve some of the things we're talking about? And I also want to give a shout out to Travis County because I wasn't really aware for a long time just how much impressive when we talk about that grasslands, buying up pieces of land that formerly agricultural and preserving it because the area is getting so rapidly developed with almost no planning and no density, right? But taking these pieces and actually restoring the land bit by bit is actually quite inspiring and I think a bright spot we should look at. But internally, when we talk about displacement and also just place and belonging in a city, public space is so critical to being able to exist in a place without spending money, right? Where can you be in Austin that you don't have to pay to exist, right? Unless somebody invites you to an event for a little bit, maybe you even get free parking, or maybe you get a snack, right? But our parks and our libraries are the only places left that we can just be without having to pay money, right? So when you look at the Miller development, which is residentially, the racial breakdown of property owners, 90% white. When you go into Mueller Park on a Saturday, you see everybody. Everybody's there. That's public space. I was walking up and down with my dad on his 76th birthday. He's been in Austin since 71 when he moved here, right? And we were walking up and down Butler Trail and then Auditorium Shores, right? And all these people just laying out. And here's big mushroomed downtown that's now more thousands of dollars a square foot than you could possibly imagine. And here are people on the lawn, on their yoga mat with their dog, just being. And he said, my entire adult life, people have been fighting to commercialize this lawn. because there's so many other high value dollar amount things that you could be doing with this piece of land, right? But thousands of people, no matter who you are, if you're there, you can just be on a nice day. And that's something so, what is the value of that? You know, once it's gone, it's gone. So public space and green space, so much opportunity and also value that I think we don't even really calculate sometimes.
Just to add to that, I think, God, I can't remember the exact number, but there's this PARD statistic that's like, something like over 90 or 95% of the protected and managed lands, open space lands in Austin are west of I-35. We have a lot of parkland, or land that is owned by the Parks Department that isn't publicly accessible or isn't managed as a parkland east. There's some examples of that where they've done some planning work. John Trevino's an example of a park space that is not developed and not accessible, as far as I know. But we're missing opportunities to do a few things. So I think we have historically thought about parks as facilities for recreation, and I think that we can think in a more multi-benefit way about the way we can capture stormwater, provide habitat, be stewards of landscapes, promote blackland prairie restoration. There's some good examples of that. Out east, actually, like Walter E. Long has a blackland prairie, like a prairie preserve section of Walter E. Long, and there's been more work that PARD has done around there's a land management plan that focuses on climate resilience in PARD assets, and that's exciting work to be done. But there's certainly disparate distribution of lands in the city. There's another point I was going to make. I'll stop there, but I can always follow up.
Anybody else want to add? There's a lot of very good questions here, and I won't get to ask them all. But I'm starting to combine things. But there's questions about what is the city currently doing. Initiatives essentially related to mitigating future challenges or the rapid increase in development. There's questions about how do we make sure the future plans don't bring more displacement. And in general, I would like to, when I ask you all to introduce yourselves, most of you talked about opportunities and strategies and solutions that actually exist. And that kind of continues on, I think, on the theme that we started yesterday with our opening keynote on climate change that was really about solutions do exist and can be implemented now. So I would like to combine all these thoughts, given that we have about 6 minutes left, and ask you all to talk about what strategies either are being in place right now or what strategies you think should be put in place to address some of these challenges, what opportunities we have to address these challenges, and how do we ensure that those opportunities are equitable. And I know there's a lot to unpack in there, so choose the part that you prefer if you want.
Sure.
Matt, you want to start, or Nefertiti, you want to start? Yeah.
Yeah.
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay, I'll go ahead. I heard a lot in that
There's
statement.
a lot, yes.
And I'm thinking about a couple of developments. Number one, Colony Park, which I'll refer to. And then also there is Project Connect. I really think we have great opportunities. It just depends on how do we seize those opportunities. And I think I will say the citizens of Austin are very brave and bold with the passage of, I guess, Prop A and B for Project Connect and the $300 million. That was unprecedented. We understand there are some limitations with that $300 million, especially as the project costs are also increasing, right? For Colony Park, we are the community has stated what they wanted, and one of the things that will be is a displacement mitigation plan. And what is that for Colony Park? And so we are in conversation with the developer, with the community members, and there's so many groups that are focused on Colony Park. And we want to see how do we ensure that the residents, and we're talking about developing an area that there are no residents there now, but we have to think about the unintended consequences as development comes. How do you protect the people and the residents who are there now. So that's really a priority for us as a city. And I won't say that's not just my department, but that is throughout the city with EDD, transportation, and other departments sort of looking at how do we protect residents and homeowners. And Colony Park has a larger percentage of homeowners in the city than some of the other areas. So one of the challenges I will say that continues to exist to me in our work is really addressing the needs of homeowners. And I understand we do have the largest percentage of Austinites are renters. And so a lot of our work is focused on renters. And we have more flexibility in terms of what we can do for them. I'm very challenged to address the needs of homeowners, especially low-income seniors. Like, those are the people I'm thinking about that I don't have a solution to address their needs. And it's generally around taxes, right? With the increasing taxes, I don't have a solution. I can't use city funds, city dollars to help reduce their tax burden. And so I'm seeing people who are 80 years old who are continuing to work, right? And so there have been other cities that are tapping into philanthropic dollars, but philanthropic organizations are stepping up to the plate, and we haven't really seen that in the city of Austin. So I'll just like to state that we have some very unique opportunities with two major projects that I'm thinking about, Project Connect, and then also with Colony Park. And I think everyone is watching us to see what we will do. And so we'll see in 10, 15 years what this looks like. But I want to share this. This might be a little alarming. We've looked at our displacement risk maps from when we started Project Connect. There are more neighborhoods that have been added to either they're in the stage of active displacement risk or vulnerable to displacement. So those areas that are experiencing displacement, which I don't think this is a surprise to any of you, but I just wanted to leave you with that happy note.
Matt, do you want to go ahead? And we'll still probably like a few minutes from the break. We have a break, right? A half hour, is that right? Yes, I'll still like 5 minutes so all of you can give your thoughts.
I'll try to keep it short.
That's good.
But I will say, speaking as kind of a representative of, as a scientist and as an engineer, I think there is a role for technical solutions to play. It's obviously not going to cover all of the problems, but I think that for one thing, it can help us to better understand what's going on inside urban drainage systems and what we can do to make them operate better. I will say that when it comes to knowing what's actually going on inside of storm sewer pipes, it's almost a complete unknown. So often these systems are built, but they aren't really monitored after the fact to see whether they're performing or whether they're inducing downstream impacts that might be more than what were anticipated. So I know my student encountered this problem in one of the deployments that we created in Dove Spring, which is an underserved neighborhood on the southeast side of Austin. We deployed sensors to see how well these systems were performing, and we noticed that one of the sensors was reporting, for several months, a very high water level measurement, and we wondered what was going on. It turned out that that culvert, which is a type of drainage passage, it was blocked by debris for about 2 or 3 months, and no one had noticed. So often we just don't know what's going on inside these systems. We don't evaluate them to see if they're performing as they should be. And often we don't know where flooding problems really occur. So most of the information on where flooding occurs comes from, probably the most prevalent source would be from things like 311 calls, but we know that those are typically calls that are made by wealthier, whiter citizens. So we often don't know, especially in underserved neighborhoods, where flooding problems are actually occurring. So I think there is a role for technical innovations to play in helping to characterize, one, what's actually going on in our existing infrastructure in terms of flooding problems, water quality problems, and so on. And second, on the kind of computational and modeling side, understanding what this interaction is between localized flooding and riverine flooding. Again, this is very rarely modeled in detail to understand what is the interaction between the stormwater infrastructure and localized flooding. So it's, again, another unknown, but it's just one aspect of the problem. Again, technical solutions won't get us to the goals that we want to achieve here alone. So.
Katie or Carmen? Do we want to go first?
Carmen should wrap us up. But no, so if that's okay, I mean, save the best for last. All right, so solutions-wise, I think whether it's this year or in 2026, a climate justice-focused bond or some other large-scale funding mechanism is, I think, one of the biggest opportunities for impact to actually move the needle and not just kind of continue to chip away. So what that looks like, I mean, two kind of key things. I mean, these are only two that might not even make it in the way I'm going to describe it in this package proposal. We still have a lot of work to do to figure out what that proposal is going to say by May 30th, which is when we're supposed to bring it back to council. But again, that 20,000 additional acres in protected status called out in climate equity plan, like we don't have a land acquisition strategy at a large scale for East Austin, like we have historically for West Austin. And I already kind of went over why that is so important, how it crosses so many different goals that we can accomplish related to environment, climate, equity, et cetera. The other piece is, I think we talked a little bit about, I kind of left you with a question before I handed it over on, do we really want inferior environmental outcomes for affordable housing? And really, my opinion is, from a restorative justice perspective, we should actually be having superior outcomes for affordable housing.
Absolutely.
So how do we set up financing mechanisms where we have funding where the city can cost share with folks who are committing to affordable housing on things like green infrastructure that we can even help to make sure are even better than what code would dictate, but that we will agree to help at least fund in part or in whole. That doesn't really exist yet. I think the last thing I'll leave you with is a little bit more upstream than some of these real tangible Austin things. We don't talk enough about mental health. And I'm not just talking about like trauma and communities and like people being displaced and like the generational trauma that comes from what communities in Austin have experienced and continue to experience from displacement pressure, among many other things. But even you, if you're a practitioner, if you're going to be a practitioner, anyone who's doing work in this field, your own individual mental health is so critical, because when I talk about binary thinking, putting things in boxes, it's a way of oversimplifying because complexity is difficult for you to cope with. And if you don't work on your own mental health and show up in that way, you're going to default to that because we're not good at coping with complexity. We're going to fall into those same patterns. So that's my high level upstream on what we need to focus on in terms of solutions.
Carmen?
And less fear-based, more love. Sorry, no more fear-based tactics. Like more love-based leadership.
Carmen?
Yeah, I think to do that, we have to create space. This is a way of creating space. This is a way of getting people from different sectors and different experiences to reflect on the stuff that impacts us and reflect on the way we do our work. When directly impacted communities that have suffered institutional and community traumas in the city of Austin actually have the space to reflect on that history, to learn, and to imagine something different, I think that is when we are actually able to give ourselves that generative opportunity to do some of this stuff. I think a couple of quick examples, the Dove Springs, where Matt mentioned, we're partnering on that. GAVA's been working in Dove Springs for about 12 years now. And I'm very, very happy to say that we've trained over 60, probably now we're up to over 100 climate navigators in Southeast Austin and all over the city. These are folks who live in areas not just affected by flooding, but sometimes it's heat, sometimes it's the winter storm, right? We worked with the city to create a basic disaster preparedness home guide, but these folks are learning how to call 311, how to report things, but also how to anticipate, prepare, and respond to climate shocks and stressors. We've also trained parent support specialists across the city in Title I elementary schools because they are very much those underpaid informal social workers and caseworkers at their schools, right? But they also know all the relationships, the community connections, and that creates a social infrastructure that allows us to be more resilient in climate shocks and stressors, but also more capable to organize for better outcomes, to become more aware of things like a land acquisition strategy for the Eastern Crescent. There's also hundreds of millions of dollars out there, bond money, the Project Connect dollars that we haven't seen. God bless Nefertiti. I need her boss's boss's boss to prioritize what is it going to take for us to spend down that money so that in 10 to 15 years, let's say at least 10,000 people in each area of the Eastern Crescent are able to stay, are able to actually keep their roots, because folks are not cashing out of the Eastern Crescent. Often they're losing money to sell a house and live somewhere else. So they're starting a new mortgage, or they're becoming renters for the first time in old age. And it doesn't have to be that way. I think also getting us in the housing conversation from a production mindset to a preservation-focused mindset, because we can actually preserve more affordable units than we can build. And if we keep affordable units and publicly affordable units, it's that public option, like what keeps FedEx and Amazon from going crazy and charging you $17 for a tiny package? It's USPS, right? Like we need some price stability that comes from our community, that's publicly owned, that's community run. And I think there are a lot of opportunities. We're looking at that in areas of Southeast Austin where communities have put so much into planning and restoration and beautification of the East Williamson Creek Greenbelt. And they're getting priced out, a lot of low-income homeowners and people who rent single-family homes. So what would it look like to create a land trust for these folks where with grant money you can actually compensate them for some of their land, allow them to keep their home structure and equity, but be able to communally as a land trust own land and keep this area affordable and family-friendly, all ages, all abilities in perpetuity? It is possible. We just have to really be able to imagine it and create the space to make it happen.
Awesome. Perfect ending. So, perfect ending. We stole 8 minutes of your break, but you still have a whole 22 until the next panel on heat. I want to thank you all for being here and the audience. And I think Slido was a win. So, thanks for participating.